Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I'm here today to respond, finally, to the Snob-O-Meter Tag created by That Reading Guy. I was tagged by several people, which usually is incredibly flattering. But in this case, I'm not totally comfortable that my name comes up so readily when you think about snobbishness. But let's see how things go. Let's get straight to the questions. First, what is your definition of book snobbery? I think there are a couple of parts to it. The most central may be that book snobbery is judging another person's reading choices as inferior, or judging a book itself as inferior because of its type rather than an evaluation of the book itself. I think what gets complicated is that these judgments that book snobs make are not infrequently based, at least to a degree, on class, economic class. I'm not going to go into a big discussion of that issue right now, but basically what book snobs tend to say has higher worth is associated with not only money, but with advanced education that money has traditionally allowed. So here's the problem. Even if a reader would never look down on people making their own reading choices, is it snobbery if you find yourself reading a fairly high percentage of books that fall into that category? If you think that when you make this kind of reading choice, it's just about personal taste, is that a kind of snobbery all its own? I'm going to have to come back to this question later, I think, in some future video after I've thought it out a bit more. But let me tell you a little bit about my experiences as a young reader first. I grew up in a family of voracious readers, and I spent my earliest years in a small town in North Carolina with a small college. It was a pretty book-filled environment, despite the fact that there was no bookstore in town. When I was a preteen, my family moved to a town along the South Carolina coast, where both my grandmothers lived, and my first cousins, and aunts, and uncles, and second cousins once removed, etc. It was where my parents had grown up. And it was very much not a bookish place. Instead of being a little college town, it was a tourist destination where tourism commerce was the economic driver. There were a lot of brilliant business people there, but they weren't intellectuals. Just that word sounds really snobby, doesn't it? Well, as a nerd, I didn't quite fit in. And my parents, even though they had grown up there, didn't fit in anymore either. Over the years, they found ways that they could fit in, and they did belong. But in those first few years when we were back, when I was in high school, we were all square pegs in a place full of round holes. Almost none of my classmates were readers. A lot of my teachers basically weren't readers either, even a lot of the English teachers. When my schoolmates saw me reading books, I think a lot of them looked down on me. Not necessarily because of which books I was reading, but the fact that I was reading at all. At the time, their disdain really hurt. Now, I think they might have felt that my reading was proof that I was looking down on them, that I was judging them in some way and finding them wanting. Was I? Maybe. At least as I felt then, I was the victim of their judgments. But it was probably a two-way street. Luckily, I did make friends there, although not over books, with one exception, a lover of Hemingway that I still see regularly, who told me not too long ago that he still uses a cross-stitch bookmark I made for him when we were in 10th grade or so. Question 2. Is there a genre or type of book you would never consider reading? Such as, would you ever read a romance? Or if you regularly read romance, would you ever try a science fiction novel? No, there really isn't a type of book or genre of books I would never even consider reading. On the other hand, there are whole genres that I tend to avoid and assume might not be perfect for me. And because of that, I seek out specific recommendations from readers I respect, readers who know me, not just the books, when I consider those genres. In general, I think my hesitations about genres are pretty gendered. Horror, science fiction, and westerns have been coded as masculine, as has a fair bit of literary fiction published by men in the mid-20th century, and that sometimes puts me off. I almost expect misogyny in books of that kind, and I know that's not fair. To a huge degree, this basic attitude of mine, which I'm trying to get beyond, is something that can easily be criticized. But I don't think it's about snobbery, per se. The third question, does erotica count as literature? Yes, I've even read some, like the writings of Anais Nin. There is a line, I think, between erotica and pornography, although I don't know enough about the field to be able to articulate it clearly. My instinct is to say that erotica requires a certain interest on the part of the author in the writing itself, rather than just the subject matter. Does that make sense? Question 4. Is it better to read classic books than popular bestsellers? Well, it is for me personally. I tend to read a lot of classics and backlisted books that have shown that they have a bit of staying power. That doesn't necessarily mean they're better books. Many of them are former bestsellers, in fact. Still, and maybe this is just because I'm an historian, if you're interested in the ways books talk to each other across the years or how they speak to different cultural moments, it's helpful to read older books. I love these large conversations between books and between readers, but of course, there is also a lot of discussion between readers of popular bestsellers. I love reading a bunch of different professional book reviews of the same book, or watching a bunch of different booktubers, or in real life friends, talk about their readings of one particular book. I definitely participate in both worlds. The fifth question, have you ever bragged about reading a classic in order to sound smart? No, it wouldn't have helped me in high school, as I said earlier. And then I went to a hyper nerdy college in the North, where I had not read a damn thing that everyone else hadn't already read. In fact, it was such a bookish community that when we were all trying to get to know each other at the start of freshman year, very frequently people would start bringing up their favorite books to see if we might have something we could chat about together. Have you read this? Have you read that? It clearly was not intended as a way to show off or put someone down, just such excitement about the books that they loved. And my answer was so frequently, no, I haven't. Do you recommend it? One day, a gang of us were walking down the very urban streets near our dorms. Back then, there were Hare Krishnas everywhere, dancing and clicking finger symbols and passing out pamphlets, etc. Have you read the Bhagavad Gita? One of the members called out. I was so shocked that someone had asked me if I had read a book that I had indeed actually read that I called out, yes, and I loved it. My college friends, all of whom seemed to have been much more sophisticated and urban aware, meaning they didn't talk to strangers on the street, immediately surrounded me and let me know that my naive southern ways didn't quite work on the streets of the big city. Perhaps. On to another question. Number 6. Do audiobooks count as reading? What about comic books or graphic novels? Yes, I think they do. There are different ways to define reading. One is the literal act of scanning one's eyes over printed text, and we usually recognize that scanning one's fingers over braille text is equivalent. But reading also means something broader than the physical act. Looking at pictures in comic books or graphic novels, or picture books for that matter, seems to be accepted as reading, even though our experience of the text is in fact mediated by looking at the corresponding pictures, which may or may not have been created by the author of the text. Or it may be mediated by listening to the voices of the narrator, who may or may not be the author. If I'm talking about my actual experience of enjoying a book, I almost always talk about reading a book only if it's text, or listening to a book if it's an audiobook, or something read aloud to me by a friend. But that is when I am using words to describe the process itself. When I'm wanting to talk about the actual book, I use the word read to mean the broader experience. I just referred to book as something broad, a physical copy, a digital file on an e-reader, an audiobook, a comic book. If the word book is so broad, can we use the word read that broadly too? At the same time, I fully acknowledge that the process is in fact quite different. I used to read aloud with my family a great deal, and that was one kind of experience that led to conversations with the people I loved and often imprinted those books we read aloud to each other and talked about into my life. On the other hand, when I listen to audiobooks, which I do occasionally and depended on for a while when I was having minor issues with my sight, I often have trouble reading analytically, and I often don't remember those books well either. This is my experience, not how audiobooks work. Similarly, when I read graphic novels, I have a radically different reading experience than I do when I'm reading text. And even when I'm reading text, I have such a better memory for physical books, and I understand their structures so much more intuitively, probably because I'm physically reminded of it as I balance the weight as I work my way through. So I'm certainly not suggesting that all forms of reading are the same, but I will insist that they all have something in common that's quite different from films or music or whatever. The next tag prompt. Have you ever looked down at someone for reading a popular fluff book? For example, a self-help book or a celebrity memoir. I don't look down on people for reading anything. As I mentioned in a fairly recent video, I read a ton of parenting and child development books when I had a child. I think most of them would qualify as self-help, or at least advice. I read them critically, playing very different opinions off against each other, and it really helped me both learn new things and also consider how I felt about things myself. Actually, Roz of the channel Scaply Dambling About the Books mentioned to me that on occasion she worries that a self-help book could take advantage of a vulnerable person. I hope I'm repeating her correctly. I think that's a brilliant point. But that isn't looking down on someone at all. Instead, it's wanting to make sure that they're okay. Okay, question 8. Have you ever been the recipient of someone else's snobbery? I hang out with a group that has several serious readers in it. Each of us have different tastes, with some overlaps, but lots of personal quirks. Occasionally, one of them will laugh at one of my choices and say something like, "You are the only person I know who would read that," or, "Well, of course you're reading that." They certainly aren't looking down on what I'm reading, nor are they acting like it's a snobbish thing for me to be reading those books. They're just acknowledging that I am who I am, and I like that. And because I'm now more aware of new books coming out, because of my involvement in BookTube and in the book review world, I can pass on information about forthcoming books that might appeal to each of them, but not me, based on their reading interests and reading quirks. The 9th question. Would you ever be friends with a snob? Maybe you already are. Depending on your level of snobbery, or the meaning of snobbery, absolutely, and I might really like talking about pretentious books with you sometimes. But if the person is regularly looking down on what I'm reading, and not just quietly, internally looking down on the book, but explicitly condemning me for reading it, I don't think I'd have an easy time maintaining that friendship. I don't mean when my friends tease me about my reading tastes being different from theirs, or teasing me for not yet reading something that they think I should have read, or whatever. That kind of thing I love, when it's clear it's coming out of fondness and recognition that we might be different readers. That's not snobbery at all. Question 10. Are people who don't read less sophisticated than people who do? Absolutely not. One of the smartest people I've known in my life, who certainly understood more about the broader world than I do, was my spouse, David. When we first met, when we were in graduate school, he did read the newspaper, and he read medical studies for school, but he basically never read just for pleasure. Before we even started dating, we studied together, and we'd frequently find ourselves talking about what he was learning, or what I was reading about in my history classes. He was tremendously curious about the world. He hadn't grown up in a bookish family, and he had other ways of learning about that world. Still, over time he did become a reader, a serious and frequent reader. And while it didn't make him more sophisticated, that bookish chatter between us was a really lovely bond throughout our marriage. And the last substantive prompt, measure yourself. Based on your answers to the previous 10 questions, would you qualify as a book snob? I don't think so, at least if you define snobbery as judging other readers rather than choosing to read nerdy books. Is that fair? All right, that will do it for this tag. I'm not going to tag anyone today because I'm coming to this a bit late, and so many people have already answered the tag and tagged a large number of people themselves. But if you're waiting for someone to tag you, which of course is always unnecessary in tags, but still consider yourself tagged by me. I'd love to see what you have to say. All right, thanks for joining me for this tag today. I have a couple of other videos I want to get out soon, including both a preview of some books forthcoming in late March, as well as a used book haul. So I'll see you soon here on Hannah's Books.